At 0530 on the morning of June 16, 1943, Captain Jay Zeamer crouched in the aircraft graveyard at Doadura airfield in Papua New Guinea, stripping machine guns from the skeletons of dead B-17s in the darkness, like a man robbing a cemetery before the groundskeepers arrived. Wrecked aircraft sat in rows around him, their wings buckled and their fuselages torn open by combat damage. Engines had already been stripped for spare parts, and the aluminum skins peeled back in the tropical heat, like dead skin after a bad sunburn. Most men passed this place without looking too closely. Staring too long at broken bombers had a way of reminding you that the men who flew them often ended up just as broken and just as gone. Zeamer didn't think about the men. He thought about the guns they had left behind, and exactly how many of them he could bolt onto his own airplane before someone with more rank showed up and told him to stop. The war in the Southwest Pacific in 1943 was doing something very specific and very brutal to American bomber crews, and the commanders back at headquarters had not fully accepted the reality yet. The Japanese Zero fighter had been designed as an offensive weapon. It was light, incredibly fast, and could turn so tightly it seemed to change direction the way a hummingbird does. That agility looked beautiful in the sky, but it felt fatal if you were sitting in a B-17 trying to keep the fighter inside your gun sights. Japanese pilots had spent months studying the defensive geometry of American bomber formations, the way wolves study a herd before choosing which animal to isolate. Eventually they found the gap. A standard B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13.50 caliber machine guns in positions spread around the aircraft: waist guns, tail guns, ball turret, dorsal turret. On paper it sounded like enough firepower to scare off anything in the sky. But directly ahead of the cockpit, at the 12 o'clock position, the aircraft was protected by only a single .30 caliber weapon. Against a determined fighter pilot, that gun carried roughly the authority of an angry suggestion. A Zero pilot who knew what he was doing could line up a head-on attack, fly straight through that weak spot, fire 20mm cannon shells into the cockpit and engines, and be gone before the bomber's gunners could react. Zeamer understood exactly what was happening because he had watched it again and again on missions over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. He reached the conclusion that the engineering manuals and tactical doctrine had not yet caught up with. If there was a gap in your firepower, the answer was more firepower. And if your commanding officer believed you were already adequately armed, the only place to get more guns was a graveyard full of aircraft that nobody was officially using anymore. He had argued this point for weeks. The response from higher command had been polite, dismissive, and consistent, exactly the kind of reaction that convinced a man like Zeamer that he was right and everyone else was wrong. The airplane Zeamer had claimed for himself was a B-17 so battered and ancient that the ground crew at Doadura had stopped arguing about whether it was airworthy and started treating its continued survival as a minor theological mystery. The bomber had been patched with sheet metal scavenged from wrecked aircraft. Its engines coughed and wheezed with an asthmatic rumble that made mechanics nervous, and its fuselage carried so many repairs from previous bullet holes that the original aluminum seemed almost secondary beneath the patches. Other crews looked at the airplane and refused to give it a proper name. Instead, they called it Old 666, after its tail number. In the culture of the Pacific Air War, refusing to name an aircraft was the same as refusing to name a stray dog. You did it when you didn't expect the thing to live long enough to matter. Zeamer loved it immediately. He saw the aircraft the way a mechanic sees a broken engine that everyone else has given up on, not for what it was, but for what it might become. Over several weeks of unofficial modifications, it turned into something extraordinary. The most heavily armed bomber in the Pacific, and possibly one of the most heavily armed aircraft the United States had flown up to that point. Zeamer and his bombardier, Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky, kept adding guns until the aircraft carried 19.50 caliber machine guns. They covered angles of attack the original designers had never intended, and some of the airframe probably protested in quiet structural horror. Sarnosky personally rebuilt the nose compartment so it could carry two forward-firing .50 caliber guns directly in front of his bombardier position. The man whose official job was dropping bombs had essentially redesigned his workspace around a second job, shooting down anything that tried to attack the aircraft head-on. A standard B-17 was already a formidable defensive platform. Old 666 was something else entirely. It bristled with weapons the way a sea urchin bristles with spines. There was no comfortable angle of approach. No direction an attacker could come from that didn't place multiple machine guns directly in his face. The reaction from the chain of command arrived quickly and carried a familiar tone anyone recognizes when a rigid system encounters an unconventional idea. The engineering officer explained, with the calm certainty of someone who trusted manuals more than combat reports, that the extra weight will reduce climb rate, burn more fuel, and make the aircraft so sluggish that the additional guns would probably endanger the crew more than any Japanese fighter. Other pilots walked past old 666 on the flight line and stared at it the way people stare at a car accident. They didn't want to look, but something in their brain insisted that what they were seeing mattered. They called it a flying junkyard, a Frankenstein bomber, a mechanical suicide note with wings. Some even placed bets on how many missions it would survive before the sheer weight of its own weapons shook the airframe apart somewhere over the Coral Sea. Zeamer and Sarnosky heard all of it. Then they went back to the aircraft graveyard and kept bolting on more guns, because both men had reached the same conclusion from different directions, and the conclusion was simple. At dawn on June 16, 1943, Captain Jay Zeamer crouched in the aircraft graveyard at Doadura airfield in Papua New Guinea, stripping machine guns from the wrecks of dead B-17s in the dark, like a man robbing a cemetery before the groundskeepers arrived. The ruined aircraft sat in rows around him, wings buckled, fuselages torn open by combat damage, engines stripped for parts, and aluminum skin peeling back in the tropical heat like dead skin from a bad sunburn. Most men walked past this place without looking too closely, because staring at the broken bombers reminded them that the men who once flew them were just as broken and just as gone. Zeamer did not have that problem. He wasn't thinking about the men who had died in those aircraft. He was thinking about the guns they had left behind and how many he could bolt onto his own plane before someone with a higher rank showed up to stop him. The war in the Southwest Pacific had become brutally specific for American bomber crews. The Japanese Zero fighter had been designed as an offensive weapon, lightweight, fast, and capable of turning so tightly it could change direction like a hummingbird. It looked beautiful from a distance and deadly if you were inside a B-17 trying to line it up in your gun sights. Japanese pilots had studied the defensive patterns of American bomber formations the way wolves study a herd before deciding which animal to separate. Eventually, they found the gap. The standard B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13.50 caliber machine guns spread across multiple positions: waist, tail, ball turret, dorsal turret. On paper, it sounded like overwhelming firepower, but the nose of the aircraft, the position directly in front of the cockpit, was guarded by a single .30 caliber gun that carried about as much authority as an angry suggestion. A Zero pilot who knew what he was doing could line up a head-on attack, fly straight through that gap, fire 20mm cannon shells into the cockpit and engines, and disappear before the bomber crew fully understood what had happened. Zeamer understood exactly what was happening because he had watched it happen again and again during missions over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. He reached a conclusion the manuals and tactical doctrines had not yet caught up with. If there was a gap in your firepower, the solution was simple: more firepower. And if your commanding officers believed you were already armed enough, the only place to find more weapons was the graveyard of aircraft nobody officially used anymore. For weeks he had argued this point to anyone willing to listen. The response was always the same: dismissive, confident, and final. To Zeamer, that kind of response only confirmed he was right and everyone else was wrong. The aircraft he claimed as his own was a B-17 so battered that the ground crew at Doadura had stopped arguing about whether it was airworthy and started treating its continued existence as a minor miracle. It had been patched with sheet metal scavenged from other wrecks. Its engines ran with a rough, asthmatic rumble that made mechanics wince, and its fuselage carried so many repair patches from previous bullet holes that the original aluminum barely showed beneath them. Other crews took one look at it and refused to give a name. Instead, they referred to it by its tail number, 666, a dark joke that fit perfectly with the uneasy humor of men flying a dangerous war. They called it Old 666. Zeamer loved it without hesitation. The way a mechanic loves a broken engine everyone else has given up on, because he can see what it might become. Over weeks of unauthorized modifications, it became the most heavily armed bomber in the Pacific Theater and possibly one of the most heavily armed aircraft in American aviation at the time. Zeamer and his bombardier, Lieutenant Joe Sarnosky, added gun after gun until the aircraft carried 19.50 caliber machine guns. They covered angles of attack the original designers had never considered, and some of the airframe probably protested against. Sarnosky personally rebuilt the nose compartment to mount two forward-firing .50 caliber guns directly in front of his bombardier station. The man whose primary job was to drop bombs had redesigned his entire workspace around a secondary task: shooting down anything foolish enough to attack from the front. A normal B-17 was already a powerful defensive platform. Old 666 became something else entirely. It bristled with weapons like a sea urchin with spines. There was no comfortable angle of approach, no direction an attacker could come from without staring down multiple guns. The chain of command reacted exactly as rigid institutions always react to unconventional solutions. The engineering officer patiently explained that the extra weight would reduce climb rate, burn more fuel, and damage maneuverability. In his view, the added guns made the aircraft more dangerous to its crew than to the enemy. Other pilots stopped beside Old 666 on the flight line, the way people slowed down near a car crash. They called it a flying junkyard, a Frankenstein bomber, a mechanical death wish with wings. Some even placed bets on how many missions it would survive before the weight of its own weapons shook the airframe apart somewhere over the Coral Sea. Zeamer and Sarnosky listened to all of it and kept installing guns. They had reached the same conclusion from different directions. The Japanese fighters destroying American bombers were not going to be discouraged by careful adherence to doctrine. And the men laughing at Old 666 had never sat inside a burning cockpit, while a Zero lined up a head-on attack run with nothing between them and 20mm cannon shells, except a weak .30 caliber gun. The brass wanted a war fought by the manual. The manual was getting good men killed. Zeamer had long ago decided he had no interest in dying for someone else's paperwork. So when the 5th Air Force posted a reconnaissance mission over Bougainville Island, a mission every other crew quietly avoided, Zeamer walked into the briefing room and volunteered before the officer even finished explaining why it was considered almost impossible to survive. Old 666 was already fueled and armed. It had been waiting. The crew Zeamer assembled around that aircraft was not the kind featured on recruitment posters. That was intentional. He selected them personally because he understood that the qualities making a man difficult inside a normal squadron were often the same qualities that kept him alive once a situation stopped being normal. Bomber crews were usually assembled through personnel offices and assignment rosters, matching qualifications and seniority. It produced crews that were competent, interchangeable, and often dead. Zeamer built his crew the way a mechanic builds a custom engine. He ignored the parts that looked perfect on paper but performed poorly in reality. Instead, he chose men for qualities the paperwork never measured: aggression, adaptability, and the willingness to fly missions described in the calm bureaucratic language headquarters used when it wanted to acknowledge danger, without openly admitting it was sending men to die. By official standards, the 10 men aboard Old 666 were misfits, reassigned troublemakers, pilots and gunners known for asking too many questions and pushing the limits of their orders. Not incompetent men, which would have been easy to handle, but the far more troublesome kind. Men who were frequently right in ways that made their superiors uncomfortable. Zeamer understood them because he was one of them. He had been reassigned 7 times in 2 years, not because he lacked skill, but because he flew with relentless, forward-leaning aggression that disrupted the tidy order of military bureaucracy. At the same time, he logged more combat hours than most pilots in theater, volunteering for mission after mission with the determined logic that the only way to master something dangerous was to do it repeatedly until the danger felt manageable. Joe Sarnosky was cut from similar cloth, but shaped differently. Quiet, technically brilliant, and precise to the point of obsession, he expressed himself through the meticulous way he maintained equipment and prepared his work. As bombardier aboard Old 666, his official job was to operate the bomb site and manage the release sequence, a process requiring mathematics, spatial awareness, and steady nerves few men possess at his level. But Sarnosky saw the forward firing gap the same way Zeamer saw the boneyard full of guns, as an engineering problem nobody else had solved. So he solved it himself. Installing the two forward-firing .50 caliber guns meant rebuilding the interior of the nose compartment from scratch, rerouting cables, reinforcing mounts, and creating a firing position the aircraft designers had never planned. The result turned the front of the bomber into a weapons platform with a bomb sight attached, rather than the other way around. All of this unofficial engineering sparked constant debate between Zeamer and the officers responsible for keeping his aircraft flying. Technically, the engineering officer was correct. The extra weight reduced performance exactly as predicted, but Zeamer was also correct. The lost performance was a price worth paying for the firepower it bought. Both men were right. The difference between them was not technical. It was philosophical. The engineering officer was trying to optimize the aircraft's survival under normal conditions. Zeamer was optimizing for his crew's survival in the conditions he actually expected to face. Old 666 climbed more slowly, burned fuel faster, and turned with the heavy reluctance of an aircraft carrying more weight than its designers intended. In exchange, it could throw a storm of lead at an attacker coming from almost any direction, which in the tactical environment of the Southwest Pacific was worth far more than a few extra knots of climb rate. Long before the Bougainville mission placed Old 666 into the history books, the aircraft and its crew had already built a reputation across the 5th Air Force that mixed admiration with unease. It was the same feeling people had watching a tightrope walker cross a wire, without a net. Impressive, but impossible to watch without expecting disaster eventually. Zeamer flew the missions nobody else volunteered for. Deep reconnaissance flights over heavily defended targets where a single aircraft had to fly straight and level while cameras in the bomb bay photographed everything below. Missions without fighter escort, where maintaining precise heading mattered more than evasive maneuvers, and survival depended entirely on whether the bomber could endure the punishment long enough to finish the job. He flew these assignments again and again, returning with the intelligence photographs the planners needed but could not obtain any other way. Each time Old 666 landed, the ground crews patched it back together once more, adding new sheets of metal over the growing collection of repairs that already covered the fuselage like a quilt stitched from the wreckage of other aircraft. The mission order for June 16th arrived at Doadura with particular tone of bad news disguised as routine paperwork. On the surface, it looked like another standard request, written in the calm language of operational summaries. But anyone who read it carefully understood exactly what it meant. 5th Air Force needed detailed reconnaissance photographs of the Japanese airfield complex at Buka on the northern tip of Bougainville Island. The images were required for planning a major Allied offensive aimed at breaking the Japanese defensive line across the central Solomon Islands. The photographs were essential. The schedule was fixed, and the mission profile left little room for optimism. A single aircraft would fly hundreds of miles across open ocean without fighter escort, cross the coastline of one of the most heavily defended Japanese islands in the theater, and maintain a straight photography run directly over an airfield protected by anti-aircraft guns and a standing combat patrol of 0 fighters. By the time the bomber reached the target, the fighters would already be airborne and climbing to intercept. Every crew that read the briefing performed the same calculation. The odds between what the mission required and what a reasonable person could expect to survive simply did not invite volunteers. The sign-up sheet sat untouched on the briefing room table, heavy with the silent understanding of everyone who had already decided not to touch it. Even the mathematics of interception were discouraging. Japanese radar and coast watchers would detect the bomber long before it arrived. The fighters at Buka would have time to gain altitude and position themselves for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, exactly the tactic designed to overwhelm a lone bomber's defenses before it could finish its photography run. The planners understood this. The crews understood it. And the sign-up sheet remained empty until Zeamer walked into the room. He studied the mission brief with the calm expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem. Then he signed his name, turned around, and walked back to the flight line where Old 666 waited under the tropical sun, 19.50 caliber machine, guns pointing in nearly every direction, fully fueled and fully armed. The kind of machine built by men who expected to be outnumbered. Before dawn, the crew of Old 666 gathered around a field table at Doadura airfield and ate breakfast in the darkness. 10 men sitting quietly together with the focused calm of people who had already made their decision and were simply waiting for the moment when that decision became action. They had been briefed, fed, and told in the careful language of military necessity that the mission carried a very real chance of killing all of them. None of this surprised them. They had understood the situation the moment Zeamer returned from the briefing and told them what he had volunteered them for. The night air around the field was warm and heavy with the smell of aviation fuel and wet vegetation. Hundreds of miles away across open ocean, the Japanese garrison at Buka continued its morning routine with no reason to expect anything unusual. Old 666 lifted off the Doadura runway as the first pale light began separating the sky from the dark outline of the jungle. The bomber climbed slowly into morning air, heavy and determined, straining upward with the stubborn persistence of a machine carrying far more weight than it was ever designed to lift. Zeamer held the aircraft steady on course and allowed it to gain altitude gradually, forcing a heavily loaded B-17 into a steep climb which stressed the airframe in ways mechanics had already warned him about. He needed every part of the bomber functioning when they reached Bougainville, which meant treating the aircraft gently during a long flight out, patience he had no intention of showing the Japanese fighters waiting ahead. The journey across the Solomon Sea lasted more than 3 hours. Old 666 cruised at 25,000 feet through clear, cold skies that looked almost peaceful from that altitude. Each crewman remained at his station. The 19 guns were clean and loaded. In the nose compartment, Joe Sarnosky checked the cameras again and again until he was certain they would operate perfectly. Every man on board understood the tactical reality of the mission with a clarity no official language could soften. A single B-17 flying over a heavily defended Japanese airfield was the aerial equivalent of walking into a room full of people who wanted to kill you and announcing your arrival by turning on all the lights. The Zero fighters at Buka would be scrambled the moment coast watchers and radar stations detected Old 666 approaching. They would climb to altitude and position themselves for interception with the practiced efficiency of pilots who had spent 2 years doing exactly that. Minute one of the photography run began when Zeamer leveled the aircraft over the target at the precise altitude and heading Sarnosky needed to capture clear images of the Buka airfield complex. The instant the bomb bay doors opened and the cameras began working, Old 666 became the most committed aircraft in the Pacific. It had to fly straight and level. Any deviation would ruin the photographs and defeat the entire purpose of the mission. Below them, the Japanese airfield lay clearly visible in the morning light. Runways, revetments, and fuel depots were arranged with the neat precision of a base built to support a long war. Zeamer held the bomber perfectly steady while the cameras recorded everything, and the crew scanned the sky with the focused awareness of men who knew the threat was already airborne. Minute 2 was when the Zeros arrived. 17 fighters climbed from Buka in a coordinated interception, approaching from multiple directions in the multi-axis attack pattern Japanese pilots had perfected for destroying lone bombers. It was a tactic designed for exactly this situation. A single aircraft that could not maneuver, could not hide, and had to endure whatever the attackers delivered until the cameras finished their work or the bomber stopped being an aircraft. The attack forced gunners to divide their attention across too many targets at once. Against a standard B-17 with 13 guns and known defensive gaps, the tactic had destroyed many crews before. Minute 3 proved why 19 guns were different from 13. The fighters attacking from a nose, the angle that had long been the bomber's weakest point, flew directly into the 2 forward-firing .50 caliber guns Sarnosky had installed in the rebuilt nose compartment. At close range, heavy machine gun fire into the engine and cockpit of a lightweight fighter produced immediate results. The lead Zero disintegrated in midair, struck at exactly the wrong point. The pilots behind him broke formation to avoid the debris, and the carefully timed coordination of the nose attack collapsed in the moment it mattered most. Minute 4 brought the first serious hits to Old 666. A Zero attacking from the left fired 2 20mm cannon shells into the cockpit. The explosions filled the flight deck with shrapnel that tore through both of Zeamer's legs and ripped open his arms. Under normal circumstances, Any pilot with injuries like that would hand control to the co-pilot immediately. Zeamer glanced at the instruments, confirmed the bomber was still flying, confirmed the photography run still had time remaining, and kept both hands on controls while the gunners fought off the attackers. Minute 5 brought a shell into the nose compartment where Sarnosky was working. The explosion destroyed much of the forward section of the aircraft and left him critically wounded. Any medic would have told him to lie still and wait for treatment. Sarnosky ignored the injuries. He pulled himself back to the guns and fired one last sustained burst at a Zero lining up for another frontal attack. The .50 caliber rounds tore into the fighter at close range, forcing it to break away. Moments later, Sarnosky collapsed across his weapons and never rose again. Having spent the final moment of his life doing the exact job, he had rebuilt his workspace to perform. Minutes 6 through 10 became a running battle across the sky. Old 666 turned away from Bougainville with the photographs complete, while the remaining Zero fighters continued attacking during the long flight back over open ocean. The gunners fired from every position with calm, efficient precision, carefully rationing ammunition while calculating the distance still separating them from safety. The aircraft was badly damaged. 2 engines ran rough. Fuel leaked from punctured tanks. Control cables were severed in several places. The oxygen system had been destroyed, forcing the crew to remain at altitude with only adrenaline keeping them functional. Zeamer flew the crippled bomber for more than an hour with both legs shredded by shrapnel. He continued operating the rudder pedals through injuries that should have made movement impossible, keeping the aircraft on course through sheer upper body strength and an unshakable refusal to give up control. Because the alternative to him flying the aircraft was 10 men dying in the Solomon Sea, and Zeamer had long ago decided he was not going to allow that outcome on a day when the aircraft was still technically capable of flight. He brought old 666 down onto the Doadura runway with 2 engines out and no hydraulics. The bomber trailed smoke and fuel vapor as it approached. The landing was hard, ugly, and completely successful. The landing gear held. The battered airframe stayed intact, and every surviving crew member stepped away from an aircraft that had absorbed more punishment than anyone thought possible. Joe Sarnosky did not walk away. The ground crew at Doadura had seen damaged aircraft before. Every mechanic working a Pacific airfield had learned the vocabulary of combat damage. Fuel tanks riddled with holes, fuselages stitched with bullets, control surfaces hanging by cables instead of hinges. But the aircraft that rolled to a stop that afternoon went beyond anything they were used to seeing. Old 666 had been struck more than 100 times by cannon shells and heavy machine gun rounds. The damage covered the entire bomber from nose to tail. This was not a plane that had been grazed in passing. It was an aircraft that had flown to the center of a storm of gunfire and somehow survived it. Mechanics walking around the bomber began counting holes and eventually stopped, simply staring at it. The real question was not how many times the aircraft had been hit. The real question was how it had managed to remain a single aircraft instead of breaking apart over the Solomon Sea. Zeamer was pulled from the cockpit and rushed to the field hospital. Surgeons spent hours removing shrapnel from his legs and arms and repairing injuries that should have made it impossible for him to continue flying during combat, let alone land a 4-engine bomber safely. The doctors told him he would never fly again. Zeamer accepted this information politely and disagreed with it privately. Over the following months, he moved through hospitals across the Pacific and back in the United States, rebuilding his strength with the same stubborn persistence he had once used to rebuild old 666 from spare parts in the aircraft graveyard. Eventually, he proved the doctors wrong and returned to flight status, because he was not the kind of man who accepted permanent defeat when temporary recovery was still possible. The photographs Sarnosky died to obtain were developed and delivered to the planning staff of the 5th Air Force. They provided the detailed intelligence coverage of the Buka airfield complex that commanders needed to prepare the coming Allied offensive. The images revealed runways, revetments, fuel depots, and defensive positions with enough clarity for planners to design attacks with far greater precision than guesswork would have allowed. Those plans became part of the larger Allied campaign that slowly dismantled the Japanese defensive perimeter across the central Solomon Islands. Mile by mile, The reach of Japanese air power was pushed back in a costly, but ultimately successful advance that would eventually bring American forces within striking distance of Japan itself. The importance of old 660 SIXS mission was not limited to fighters it shot down or drove away that morning. Its value extended forward in time through every operation planned using the intelligence those photographs provided, because 10 men had flown a mission that every other crew in the theater had declined. The decorations that followed became one of the most concentrated recognitions ever awarded to a single bomber crew during the Pacific War. The official citations described their actions in formal military language, but behind the careful wording was a quiet acknowledgement that the aircraft once dismissed as a flying junkyard had accomplished exactly what its critics believed impossible. Zeamer received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, for holding the aircraft steady during the photography run while fighters attacked, for continuing to fly after suffering severe wounds, and for bringing his crew home in a bomber that should never have survived the damage it had taken. Joe Sarnosky received the Medal of Honor posthumously for continuing to fight at his guns after being mortally wounded, protecting the aircraft long enough for the mission to succeed. The decoration recognized Sarnosky's final act, returning to his guns after being gravely wounded and firing the burst that broke the momentum of the nose attack at the exact moment it needed to be stopped. That single action kept the aircraft in the fight long enough for the crew to finish the mission and turn for home. After the battle, 5th Air Force engineers examined the shattered remains of old 666. They discovered that the engineering officers' concerns about the extra gun mounts had been structurally correct but tactically irrelevant, exactly the balance Zeamer had always argued. The bomber had carried more weight than its designers intended, yet the added firepower had changed the outcome of the fight. Soon the same officers who had once mocked the modifications began studying how they could be copied. The forward-firing nose gun Sarnosky had built from scrap parts in the Doadura boneyard became the basis for new defensive improvements on other aircraft. What had once been dismissed as a Frankenstein bomber and a flying junkyard gradually evolved into a design change with official part numbers, engineering approval, and a place in military planning documents. Stripped of the story behind it, the idea still carried the insight that had inspired it in the first place. The gap in the bomber's nose had been real, and it needed to be filled. After the war, Jay Zeamer returned home to a country eager to move forward after years of conflict. He settled in Maine and lived a quiet life that bore little resemblance to the man who once stripped guns from wrecked aircraft in the dark and flew an overloaded bomber into 17 enemy fighters because someone had to do it. He did not display his Medal of Honor prominently or retell the story of Bougainville at dinner parties. Men who earn that medal are rarely comfortable talking about the events that produced it. Zeamer had always been more interested in solving the next problem than in receiving credit for the last one. He lived to be 87 years old, long enough to see the world he had helped defend change in ways that would have seemed unimaginable from the cockpit of old 666. The memories of that day in June never disappeared. Like many combat veterans, he carried them quietly, close to the surface, even as decades of ordinary life built up around them. Joe Sarnosky was 26 years old when he died at his guns in the nose of old 666. He never came home, but the photographs he gave his life to obtain did exactly what they were meant to do. The mission succeeded. The intelligence they captured helped shape the operations that followed. And the same men who once laughed at the extra guns eventually wrote the official citations praising those guns as the reason the crew survived. Somewhere in that story lies a simple truth. Sometimes a few people see the real problem, while everyone else only sees the rules. The distance between those two ways of thinking can be the difference between defeat and victory, and sometimes between life and death. Stories like this are remembered so that Jay Zeamer and Joe Sarnosky are never lost to silence.